Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're talking about the idea of lethal superheroes. Should superheroes kill? What happens when they decide not to kill? And is there a difference between killing in battle versus killing as punishment? We'll be discussing this through the lens of Jupiter's legacy and Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Matthew, your host. Sometime in the next couple of weeks, quite possibly next week or the week after, we're going to do a feedback episode. We've been getting a lot of great feedback, questions, and comments about recent episodes we've had. Some people giving us great insight, calling me out on something I totally missed I'm looking forward to talking about, some other great insight about stuff we've talked about. And so we're going to do a whole episode on feedback, which means if you've got a question you've been wanting to ask, a comment you've been thinking you want to make, this is a great time to do it. Email me at theethicalpanda@gmail.com. Or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter at that same name. Contact us in any of those ways. If you can find me with carrier pigeon, it'll be a little creepy, but you still go ahead and do it. But any of those things you can do, send us in your feedback, send us in your thoughts. We'll look forward to reading it on that whole episode. And today, this is an episode I'm really excited about because this is both a topic that we've gotten into a number of times in one way or another, but never really gotten to just sink our teeth into this whole topic as nothing but for an episode. And we're doing it with two of my favorite guests, people who have been on quite a lot, and unfortunately, except for the 100th episode, I haven't had you both on, but I'm here with Paul and with Jessica. And start with you, Paul. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. It's really more like late afternoon where I am, but, West Coast.
That's fair.
Yay.
And Jessica, over in the East Coast, how are things for you?
I'm good. I'm enjoying being so close to the Atlantic Ocean instead of the Pacific.
Now I miss the East Coast.
Yeah. Jessica's in our old home of New York City. But yeah, no, I'm glad to have you both here. And let me kind of frame a little bit more the topic we're talking about because, I've talked with both of you about this question of should superheroes kill and what does it mean when superheroes decide they are not going to kill? And what does it mean when, with comic book physics, the writers decide that Daredevil is definitely not killing by hitting people in the head with metal pipes or things like that. Not that I've used that example one or two times in the past.
Yeah, let's work on some others. Sorry.
Yeah, some good ones. Batman, for example, another one. He never kills anyone, I'm sure. But even going beyond the comic book physics stuff, there's a lot of questions that really come up around these ideas of should heroes kill? Is it something that they should always avoid? Is it something that if it happens without being planned, that's a thing, or versus it being planned? And we're going to talk a lot about it, especially in terms of the TV show that just came out, Jupiter's Legacy, as well as with some, when I was talking to Jessica about this, I know you had a lot of great insight from Flash Comics that we wanted to bring in as well. And we're going to talk about a couple of other sources. And I'll get into all the specifics of that in a moment, but let me just start with the kind of general idea for each of you. What comes up when you think about this idea of should superheroes kill?
Paul.
Oh, okay. It was like a game of reverse chicken.
Politely waiting.
I've never heard two New Yorkers be that polite before. That was amazing.
It's hilarious. I mean, I think of Batman. I think of Daredevil, especially season 1 and 2 and 3. I guess that's all the seasons.
Sadly.
Sadly.
Hashtag save Daredevil.
Yes.
I'm actually fine with an ending after season 3. I think it's the most fantastic season of television I've ever seen of anything. So, but, if they make more great seasons, cool. But yeah, it's this in Daredevil, Matt Murdock is wrestling with this, whether as Daredevil, he wants to use that as a solution to some of the problems he's facing. Batman generally will have more of this kind of code sort of thing, which I'd say Jupiter's Legacy felt very much like a sort of call out or nod to that. Mm. And I mean, a lot of other, members of the Justice League which also JL, but,
yeah.
And then you have characters like Punisher who are just going around killing everybody. And then you have characters like El Mariachi who's like, wait, let's just talk. Okay, I guess I'll kill all of you. But now you, okay, you're not, okay, I'll kill you too. And, I mean, I find it to be an interesting question in terms of I don't know, I really enjoy Batman, and particularly Batmans that don't go around killing people. And then I also really enjoy Dexter. which
Right.
is a little different. And
the friendly, charismatic serial killer.
right, exactly. And, to me, it's kind of like it's about personal choice as much as anything, but and also just the idea of like putting restraints on oneself, particularly when one has like an enormous amount of power and is often going to be operating at a power imbalance.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the first thing that comes to mind is Man of Steel, which I would argue does not handle the question particularly well. And I think a big part of it is you have to consider the character, and you have to consider the genre and intended audience. So whereas, I think that the question of whether or not lethal violence is ever morally acceptable, or even the only correct choice being a central question of something like Daredevil, is fascinating. Whereas I sure wouldn't want to see, again, Superman spending 3 seasons debating about whether or not he should murder somebody. Like, there's a lot of sort of metatextual factors that go into it, and also the idea of like, does it make your superhero story more mature, more complex, edgier, cooler if the superhero kills? Or, not to tip my hand, does thinking that a superhero killing is automatically cool mean you're actually pretty immature? I don't know. It could be either of those things.
But it could really only be the one.
I feel like that when we get into our comic book history about the 80s and 90s, that you might have some more thoughts on that particular perspective of comic book history.
I sure do have some thoughts and feelings, yes.
I'm very interested to hear those. I like where this is going.
Well, and so I think you kind of really kind of put your hands on a number of the different parts of the questions that we're looking at here. Because for me, I kind of feel like there's 3 different sort of aspects of killing that we're talking about here. One of which is the idea of the hero who is attempting to use non-lethal force, but will wind up using lethal force because you can't quite dial that gun as perfectly as we would sometimes have. We joke about that a lot, and we've talked about it some. I think today we're not talking about that as much, because we're talking more about the when a hero is saying like, I am okay with killing. But even there, I feel like we still have 2 very different kinds of situations. One of which is I have decided that this person has to die because no prison can help them, no insane asylum can help them, no, there's nothing else to do. I have to kill this person. Versus I'm in the heat of battle, and the only way to end the threat that they pose to me and to everybody else around us is to kill them. And so I think that's a question we're going to really dive into, and we'll start talking about Jupiter's Legacy in a second. The only other thing that I want to say, though, and I can hear your thoughts on both of these before we get into Jupiter's Legacy specifically, is I feel like that this has always been true, but especially in the last couple of years, for me at least, it is impossible to think about heroes using lethal force to stop bad people without thinking about law enforcement and the military using lethal force to stop what they perceive to be bad people. And I think, especially with Jupiter's Legacy, but with a lot of this stuff, there's always been problems in our own world about cops using lethal violence in situations where clearly they shouldn't. But especially with all the attention paid to it the last couple of years, I'm at least finding it harder and harder to get excited about watching heroes kill criminals or kill the people they think of as bad guys in that kind of a way. Not that it has to be, complete the other end, and sometimes stories can set up situations where it does seem to be like necessary in the heat of the moment or whatever. But for me, I feel like this entire question has to be viewed through that kind of a lens. Does that make sense to you both?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely take your point. I agree with you that it's something that, as obviously this is not a new phenomenon that's happening. People, especially Black people and other people of color, being killed by cops is not new. It's just something that, I think a lot of white people learned about for the first time in recent years, or realized how prevalent it was in recent years. And it's something that I think we should be more thoughtful about when we depict, honorable law enforcement killing. But I do hesitate to equate the two, because so many of these incidences are like, that guy was walking down the street, or a child playing in a park, or a woman sleeping in her own bed, as opposed to, in superhero stories, I can think of a couple of examples of superheroes accidentally killing innocent bystanders. Actually, they're both Green Arrow. He's not doing so hot. But yeah.
Wanda Maximoff in Civil War is the one that comes to mind. But you're right, they're much rarer.
Yeah, like there is always an argument to be made when this story happens in a superhero comic that killing the bad guy was justified because they're like the Joker, or they're going to destroy the multiverse or whatever, which is not the case when it's, a black man standing in a Walmart looking at a fruit, and all of a sudden everybody freaks out for no reason. You know what I mean?
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And to be clear, I wasn't trying to equate them. It was more just that it's hard for me to think about this question without having that lens on it.
Sure,
I think you're right. That that's definitely a very big difference.
Yeah, I kind of feel both of those points of view where, there are obviously incidences, way too many incidences, where it's not, someone in law enforcement trying to apprehend someone who is clearly violating a law, and then we're talking about how force was used in that situation. I mean, I have a lot to say about those situations as well, but I think those are maybe more parallel to a lot of the kind of superhero things, where also with superheroes, sometimes you get, the superhero versus like a mugging or something, and sometimes you get the superhero trying to stop Thanos from destroying the Earth, or the superhero trying to stop Darkseid from destroying the Earth, or et cetera, et cetera. And I think those are very different. I feel like more we get these little like montages of the like, oh, here's the hero like trying to stop some crime, and then now there's going to be some like really big thing that isn't quite as related. So like I definitely do see the parallel and feel like it's hard not to have that in mind sometimes. But at the same time, I do think there's a little bit more separation and daylight between the two than is sometimes painted as.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. And I think, for me at least, Jupiter's Legacy comes a lot closer to that line, especially with some of the way they discuss it. Mm-hmm. And so let's actually use that as a good time to get into Jupiter's Legacy. Because this, the way we're framing this is, Paul and I have seen Jupiter's Legacy. Jessica has not. And we think some of you in the audience have, some of you may well have not, and that's totally okay, because we want this to be kind of like, we're going to use that as a jumping off point, but really try to stick to the issues themselves, not just get lost in the show. But in terms of what matters from the show for this question, in the show, as Paul alluded to, we have basically a Justice League. I think they're the heroes of the globe, is the word.
The Union. They're the Union.
The Union, thank you. Heroes of the Globe was something that may have been from Invincible. There's been a lot of superhero stuff I've watched recently that has Justice League aspects to it. And it's led by someone named Utopia, and Utopia has he very much is kind of a Superman figure, and he and the others have established what is called the Code. And the Code is this set of laws that the heroes have to follow under any circumstances, no questions, no, exceptions. They always have to follow it. And one of them is that they do not kill. And it's never directly explained, but I think what the implication is given, and kind of, Paul, you were alluding to this, the part of why this is set up is that when they got started, they were so much more powerful than anybody else they were dealing with, that it was kind of that idea of like a grown adult trying to deal with a 6-year-old who's causing problems. Like the 6-year-old might be about to punch another 6-year-old, and you want to stop that, but you're not going to use your full ability as an adult because they're 6 years old. And I think that's kind of the idea that's behind a lot of this idea of the code, because they often talk about, if we didn't have the code, humanity would never trust us. They would never be okay with us. But that by the time we get to the modern day story, the villains are getting more and more powerful, and that's not always becoming the case. And in the big spoilers for a major plot point in episode 1, toward the episode 1, Utopia and his son Paragon and their whole team are having a big fight with, is it Grayskull? That's T-Man.
It is not Grayskull. It is Black Star. I mean, it's a generic sounding name. Like, also it's the Utopian.
I'm going to pretend it's Grayskull.
Yes.
There you go. I was going to edit that out, but no, we're going to keep it in now. Dark Star.
Black Star.
No, Black Star. Thank you. Yes, and the Utopian. Thank you. I'm terrible with names. Last episode, I gave a whole thing about how, Stan Sebastian is a really good example of sexiness in male actors. So, me with names, I'm terrible. Anyway, and in the course of the fight, Black Star is just completely kicking butt. He has already killed 2 of the heroes, like they're fully dead, and he is about to go nuclear. And it's mentioned that if he does this, he will take out half the state. Let alone probably kill all these people, but he will, kill like half of Kansas, the state they're in. Again, no Superman illusions happening here whatsoever. And so in the heat of the fight, figuring that it's the only way he can stop this from happening, Paragon delivers a mighty blow that kills Black Star. To which Utopia immediately starts scolding him, saying you broke the code. And so this is where we kind of get this setup of, the code has to be the code uber alles, that even in that situation where terrible things were going to happen, the code has to be the thing that trumps. And then that becomes kind of one of the central ideas of the rest of the episode, the rest of the season going forward is, should that code still be there? And are there problems with it? And you have a lot of younger heroes start talking about how they don't like it. They think the code shouldn't be, and all kinds of things like that. So that's kind of what I want. That for me was what really got me thinking about this question, because it seemed like, and I'll be honest, I'm not wild about Jupiter's Legacy. I think they had some. I described it as a show that I think raises a lot of great questions, but I kind of hate the answers that it gives, and also just has some bad plotting and dialogue and stuff like that. But even putting that aside, the questions there I think are really fascinating. So let me just start with you, Jessica, as someone who hasn't seen it. Did that description make sense? Are there kind of big questions you have, or kind of what would be your thoughts on the way that question is being set up as I described it?
Yeah, no, I'm definitely following. And it's something that, I think you see this a lot in sort of creator-owned properties that are, as you said, very much inspired by DC and Marvel superheroes and these established franchises that we're very familiar with. And creators will take these sort of XP versions of the characters in the universe to explore these ideas. So it's something that DC and Marvel have explored in other stories. I mentioned to you earlier that this sort of generational divide between an old-fashioned way of superheroing and a more aggressive and violent way for the younger generation is one of the central themes of Kingdom Come, which is a DC comic by Mark Waid and Alex Ross from the 90s. And yeah, it's a topic that the genre touches on a lot, but it sounds like from everything you've said, this is perhaps more interested in and then it got really violent and it was rad side of the debate.
I think there's some of that. I think the show does try hard to, I think it's clearly showing that Utopian and the others kind of have to grow out of their old ways. But I felt at least, and Paul, give me your thoughts on this, that the show was trying hard to say like that maybe Utopian has a point. That it's not just that he's totally wrong and the young people are right.
Yes.
Also, quick plug, we actually did an episode on Kingdom Come a long time ago with Jacob Malicic. Definitely check that out as well.
Links in the show notes, right? We'll
yes.
do that. Yeah. We'll do that like I have anything to do with creating the show notes. Yeah, so I would say I think it's a show, and based on the previous material.
I'd agree, it's a show.
That is it raises some questions that are interesting. It does it in a very ham-fisted way. And it's like so on the nose that I find that off-putting. It does it. A lot of the things that happen are like, oh, well, this has to happen so that we raise this question, or you think this, or whatever. I thought parts of it were actually really well done. A lot of the stuff, the backstory, the 1929 stuff, I really enjoyed. I thought that part looked great. I thought the present day stuff was maybe a little less interesting for the most part. I would push back on that it giving answers that aren't very good, in which I feel like you just did also, in terms of saying I don't think it's this is the correct answer,
Right.
And there is, there's one great line where the utopian is basically in a therapy session and complaining about, people are saying things like the world isn't black and white like it used to be, yada, yada, yada. And, the other person's like, the world has always been chaos and shit, my friend.
Yeah.
And that's, I always think of this idea of the world's it's not as simple as it used to be. That's always struck me as bullshit. I don't think the world has ever been simple. I think a lot of people have maybe had a simple outlook on the world, and, there are things like cops murdering people that not everybody was super aware of. And becoming aware of those things makes the world feel more complicated. But that shit was happening. That shit's been happening for since there've been cops, And so the idea of maybe now there's supervillains in their world, there might be a little more substance to okay, well, there were only 6 people with superpowers, and then one of them went rogue, and then there's supervillains all of a sudden. And okay, that is an added layer of complexity, right? And
right.
Because the idea, and I think the code was 2 things. I would think it was we don't kill and we don't govern, which that's its own kind of thing too, right? We don't interfere. And we don't, deal in life and death, and we don't deal in what the law should be. We basically try to, maybe they try to stop crime. To me, what would be a reasonable approach would be we try to save lives, right? We try to keep people from killing each other. That's what I think. I think instead of cops, that's what we should have. We should have safety people who basically just try to help people from not dying. But that's a whole nother episode. But yeah, to me, it felt like it raises these questions in a very obvious, in your face, every single episode way. It's a little obnoxiously over the top in that regard. And I feel you when you're saying there is this idea of this generational divide, and the younger heroes think, oh, maybe the code's kind of bullshit. But at the same time, the older crowd, really, though, it's just as far as I can tell, the code comes from one person, Sheldon, the utopian, who has, it's the idea is people will have free will if we don't get involved in governing, if, we don't want to kill anybody. But at the same time, it's are you really giving your team free will? And I think that's sort of a second question. It's for a single hero to make the decision, I am never going to kill someone. I think that's totally legit. And, or I am never going to deliberately use violence that is intended to be lethal, right? We'll get into whether or not there's, lethal, non-lethal violence or not. But, the lack of, I'm never going to try to kill someone. I think, I can respect that, but I think that has to be, on some level, that has to be more of a personal choice. Whereas someone else, it's look, if someone's either going to kill you or I can kill them, and the writer has decided that those are my only two choices, and for some odd reason I can't laser off their arm. Like, seriously, like, just laser off their arm. Like, you don't have to laser their brain, laser their arm. You have super speed. But, like, if the writers decided that those are the two options, like, I think that's a legit choice for me to make, whether or not I want to kill someone to stop them from killing someone else. And to have some sort of code where it's like, no, none of us can do that is, you know, and then spout off about free will, it seems a little hypocritical to me. And rant.
Yeah.
I think what that brings up for me is, and this is something that I think we touched on during the 100th episode, the idea of superheroes having oversight. Like, if you are a superhero, 99% of the time, the superhero is just deciding what their code is going to be, whether they are going to follow the laws of their particular locality or they're not, or they're going to follow the ones they feel like following, which is what most of them do, because, you know, being a vigilante is usually pretty illegal. It's just, like, Batman, you are not a law-abiding person. I'm sorry. And this is something that speaking of stories that brought up interesting ideas or interesting questions and answered them maybe not in such a great way, this is something that Civil War touched on. Like, when you have superheroes who are largely American and they're incredibly powerful, but they're not just operating in America, whose laws apply and who can enforce them? And so the question of whether, you know, the utopian or any head of a leader of a superhero team can say, this is my moral code and I'm making the rest of the team follow it, I think has to take into account who are they beholden to besides themselves as individuals and the team. And, like, if they do violate the code, then what happens? Do they just punch each other until a lot of buildings fall down?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great point. I love especially that you frame it in terms of the vigilante question, because kind of the way, at least I understood it in the show, and Paul, tell me if you disagree, is that the code is, you know, it's kind of them being preemptive to create a version of the Sokovia Accords. In that the code is what allows them to not be vigilantes. It's that they sort of have a partnership with the world, however the world expresses that, which probably they don't, because there's no world government, and this does seem all very American, like all these stories do. Right. But there's kind of an idea of like, hey, world, if you'll let us function and not treat us like criminals, we will follow this code. And I think you're right, that it raises a lot of questions of, you know, because certainly some of the other heroes seem to have opinions on it, but we never got to see. And maybe this is what would be in season 2, which we just announced today is not going to happen, which I'm not terribly upset about because I didn't really love the show. Although there's some parts that were so good, it's probably frustrating. Yeah. But yeah, I think that's one thing that was left somewhat unclear, and I wish had been more explained of to what extent this was the heroes had all agreed to a code, but then most of them were drifting away, but Utopian still agreed with it, or he had just said, you know, my way or the highway, and they all kind of agreed and went along with it, but he was pressuring them. Because you're right, I think that is a very important question.
So, two things. One, I think the code for Sheldon came from a couple. Like, I think he thinks it comes from like where they got their powers. Like, I think it's kind of mystical for him. Mm-hmm. Like, literally, they were going to the place where they get their powers. There's some, I guess, spoilers for later in the season. And
we can spoil the whole thing.
Yeah, everything looks horrible. Like, they're going to die in a storm, and there's, like, arguing and fighting, and someone's about to shoot someone. And then I think Jane, right, says, she's like, oh, Grace. Her name's Grace. I'm sorry. Jane's someone else. Whatever. Anyway, she's like, she says, taking a life is never the answer. And then the clouds literally part. And, like, sunshine, like, they're hit by, like, a beam of sunshine, and then this island appears where they go and get their powers. So
after being tested again for their goodness.
Exactly. So I feel like all of that I feel like that's where Sheldon like got the code from, and it's like, no, we have to stick to this, everybody. And from the beginning, he is the one who had the sort of, who was convinced like, oh, we're gonna go to this place and something good's gonna happen, and I don't know what it is, but there's this very, it feels very faith based, right? In terms of like, there was no, there was no like trail of like breadcrumbs that were like rationally followed. It was just like, no, we have to go to here, and then they all did, and then he led them to where they got their powers, and so I think that's sort of, especially also because of what his mental state was like then, I think that's why he hangs onto the code in this very emotional way, as opposed to like thinking, oh, well, this will keep people from treating us or like coming up with their own rules for like what we have to do. And maybe he kind of sold it to the others, or maybe that's how some of the others kind of rationalized it to themselves. But I think the origin is definitely more this kind of like, sort of moment, and in terms of like what happens if someone breaks the code, in episode 1, someone breaks the code and then they get grounded. Like literally it's like, stay on the farm and put up a fence. And so that's literally the answer to that question in the show.
But even there, it's not even clear, is he doing that as like because he's punishing another hero, or is he doing that because it's his son, and he's grounding him? Yeah,
for sure.
And I really like the way you bring that up, because I think you're totally right there, especially in terms of the code. And Jessica, I'm curious if this is something we see in comic books a lot. One of the kind of feels that I get from this whole thing is that everything in Sheldon's life up to this point has been chaos. All the things that he thought he could hold on to, the goodness of his father, the solidity of his business, because all this is happening against the backdrop of the Great Depression, and everything Sheldon has believed in has gotten wiped away. His own mental health has gotten, completely out the window. He's lost his engagement. And now he has all these powers and he has no idea what to do. And I often think that when people talk about having a code, it feels like they're trying to give some order to the chaos of their life. It's like, instead of allowing myself to think like this is all chaotic and nuts and I'm going to have to figure it out, it's, nope, here's this rigid set of rules. As long as I follow it, everything will be okay. Which is interesting that you bring it up as a religious thing, because often I think that's what like fundamentalist religion can be. Here's the set of rules I have. Here's my code. I don't have to ask any questions. I don't have to engage with the complexity. I just have to follow the rules. Jessica, is that something that you kind of see, especially in some of the comic books that you've read, where the heroes seem to adopt these rules of I shall not kill or whatever the rules are, in part to kind of bring some order to that chaos?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, it depends on the character and it depends on the era. Like, if you look at, say, Silver Age, Batman and Superman comics, you will frequently see them literally referring to their code. Like, I have a code against killing. I don't kill. There's a cover of World's Finest from that era. I'm never going to remember the issue number, but it's like Superman and Batman are about to kill somebody, and Robin is like, no, you'll break your code. Like, it's, they had these rigid rules that they would put things like that on the cover so that kids would be like, oh my God, Superman and Batman are going to kill somebody. Gotta read this comic. Here's my nickel. And like, Superman also, like, he couldn't lie in the Silver Age. So if somebody was like, are you Superman, Clark Kent? He'd be like, what a crazy question. I have to leave the room, because he couldn't say no.
You can avoid the question. You just can't directly lie.
Right. Which is, I mean, that's very much from because they were still very much under the Comics Code Authority, which was a literal code in the real world of what they could publish, and the audience was little kids. In terms of more modern comics, I think you are much more likely to see very rigid rules. Or the two characters who immediately sprang to mind talking about this are actually pretty opposite in this philosophy. Batman and the Punisher. Because they both have really rigid rules about what can and cannot be done. They just happen to be very different rules. But like, Batman will not kill, and the Punisher will kill pretty indiscriminately when it's criminals, but he won't kill cops is something that comes up very often, even if they're dirty. And he won't kill
I was going to say, because cop and criminal are mutually exclusive in his world.
Yeah. Oh, and they're not in Punisher comics.
Yeah.
And he won't kill kids. And sometimes it's civilians. It differs from comic to comic, but those are also both codes, like going back to what you said about, the Utopian being, or Sheldon, which, God, his name is Sheldon.
Yeah.
What a dunk
Sheldon
on Clark Kent. But both of those codes arise out of moments of intense trauma, which I think does, reflect that idea of, my world has shattered. I need some rules to make sense of it again. And I think especially for Batman, what has always struck me about his code is that it really is, he, in some ways, and I don't mean this as an insult, but it's going to sound like it, he really does have the morality of a traumatized 8-year-old. Because he has very rigid rules about the things that an 8-year-old would understand. Like, you can't kill, you can't steal, those are bad things, and I'm going to stop them unless you're Catwoman, and then maybe you can steal because you're very pretty. Whereas when you get into more complex moral issues, like, is it okay to spy on your friends and come up with elaborate plans to kill them or take them out in case you have to, and, keep kryptonite in your pocket if you have, like, that's not anything an 8-year-old would really ever encounter. So it's sort of like the things that an 8-year-old would say, no, this is bad, are forbidden, and anything else is kind of fair game. And that is an oversimplification, and there are certainly Batman stories where he has a more complex morality, but I do think that that's something that comes out with him a lot. Whereas for characters like Superman, who don't have that formative trauma, I think he has, again, a more complex and mature and sort of robust set of ethics that are more malleable from situation to situation rather than rigid rules, because they come from being raised by good people and not, here are my rules that I came up with, I wrote them down, and I'm going to follow them.
I feel like keeping kryptonite in your, pocket is pretty reasonable if you live on a planet where Superman's, like, being controlled by Darkseid to try and conquer it, but...
That's fair.
Yeah,
but I had
even
a trauma
then it
when I was
wasn't
8, so I don't know.
Even then, it wasn't Batman who killed the person who was causing Superman's rampage. It was Wonder Woman.
Yeah. I mean, I think Amanda Waller's a hero in the DC universe, so I'm definitely on the side of keep kryptonite in your pocket. But I totally understand what you mean there, and I think, to me, I think that kind of just underlines kind of what we're talking about there in terms of that ability of the rigidness of a morality versus, like, the ability to be malleable and the ability to adapt to the circumstances. And it's interesting, Paul, that you brought up Dexter, because I can't even, I'm kind of annoyed that I'd forgotten about it, but the literal words, the code, are such an important part of Dexter, in which, spoilers for basically, like, the first 5 minutes of episode 1 of Dexter. But if you haven't seen it, it's a fantastic show. Very bloody, but even for some of the weak stomach...
3, 4, whatever seasons are a fantastic show. The last couple episodes are the worst thing that's ever been on television. Okay, proceed.
Also true.
Spoiler warning.
But, one of the ideas there is same kind of thing. Here, a character has had a horrific trauma at age, like, 3, or aged as a toddler, and now has... I'm not going to claim to know the kind of the psychiatric diagnosis, but basically to be compelled to kill, and for all kinds of, like, broken traumatic psychiatric reasons. Not saying for a moment that that's, like, a normal response to trauma. It's obviously a very extreme, specific situation, very unique, etc. But so what happens is when his father realizes this and realizes, like, he's going to be drawn to kill all of his life, he teaches him a code of, like, who he can and who he can't kill. It's very much about, like, you can only kill bad people and things like that.
Like,
and
the process of going about, like, verifying, that they've actually done the things that, he thinks they've done and whatnot.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. It's that idea that you have to verify what it is, and that you have to sort of be able to show yourself that you're not just doing this out of anger or out of vengeance, that you're doing it because you honestly believe killing this person will save more lives. And that's kind of a good segue to the thing that I think is most interesting. And you're right, Paul, when I said I don't like the way the show answers the questions, that was probably the wrong way to say it. A better way to say it is I don't like the way the show frames the question.
Oh, word.
Because it winds up, we have that first scene where Paragon, in the middle of a battle, this guy is about to kill all of our heroes and possibly half of Kansas. And we're like, we're not supposed to kill him. And then the next episode, some of these younger, superheroes who are very much like, yeah, we should be killing people. There's a moment where the villain they were fighting is captured, is on the ground, but they're wheeling out the body of one of their good friends, another hero who that villain killed.
Or injured, I think, just severely injured.
I thought it was dead, but either severely injured might be either way. But yeah, I think that may be true. And there, the hero is like, well, maybe the code's wrong, and I should kill this person. To me, there's such an interesting question here, but when you muddy the water between those two and equate those two, I feel like you really lose sight of what the question is. Because for me, at least, and I want to hear from both of you, those two situations of killing out of either vengeance or like I am deciding the world is better off without this person is so different than stopping an imminent threat.
Absolutely.
Yes. I think there's also a third point in between those two, because there's killing in the heat of battle to save a life in the immediate sense. And there is sort of which is, let's say, the most altruistic version. And then there's revenge killing, like an eye for an eye or an entire life for an eye in this particular case. But in the middle, there's the question of, there's the death penalty. Like, right. Especially in cases where the supervillain is perhaps not an imminent threat at this like they're not firing their laser eyes at somebody right now, but they do still have laser eyes and they could get out again. So do you take them out to prevent that? Because in superhero comics, we know any jail, any mental institution, which is its own extremely problematic separate issue, like they're revolving doors. So I think there's a difference between you killed somebody I love and so I'm killing you, and I know you're going to kill more people and so I'm putting a stop to it.
Right. It's interesting. I never actually thought about this until we started this conversation. But, Netflix does their TV show about Daredevil, where the whole idea is that he's wrestling with thinking that he has to kill Kingpin, and in the end decides that he can stop himself from killing Kingpin, and that's okay. And then, spoilers for season 1 of Jessica Jones, the very end of it, skip ahead a little bit if you haven't, you've both seen, Jessica, but then the next show they do, season 1 of Jessica Jones, ends with Jessica basically making the exact same decision that you're talking about. Sorry, about Jessica Jones, where I'm sure no one's ever made that comparison to you before.
It's always weird to me to talk about that show because I'm like, Jessica, not the one that's me, but a different one.
Jessica Jones, JJ. JJ decides that Purple Man, and I think rightly so, because of his power, where people just have to obey his voice no matter anything else, that there's no prison that will ever hold him and will ever stop him from doing these horrible things, and so she kills him. And so, I don't know how intentional that was of Netflix Marvel, but I think it's really interesting because we're seeing those two opposite ends of this question.
Yeah, I think it's also partially because, it also partially illuminates the difference between Matt and Jessica as characters. Mm-hmm. And I think a little bit Matt sort of enjoys agonizing over decisions, and Jessica's like, I'm decided and I'm going to do it now.
A Catholic who enjoys agonizing over the guilt? I have no idea what you're talking about there.
It's his hobby. So what would he do if he made a choice? But yeah, I think it also is very much a case of like the Kingpin. Yes, he has a lot of money. Yes, they do think that they've gotten him legally a couple of times and he slips through the cracks. But he is, at the end of the day, a regular non-augmented human who could be put in jail and stay there.
Right.
Yeah, that brings up the difference between, regular old humans and, super people. right? And I think in Jupiter's Legacy, the sense I get is that early on, they're the only supers, and so they have this huge disproportionate amount of power, and anybody that they apprehend, like, they can be dealt with in like a prison or whatever. Whereas once there are a bunch of supers running around, that is actually a legitimate change compared to like whatever's going on in the world now. Although technology changes and, you know, people have, you know, bigger guns, whatever, stuff like that. But yeah, I think someone said something that was really interesting, and then I lost my train of thought, and yeah, never mind.
40 minutes in, I hope we've said something interesting somewhere along the way.
No, it's not just you, Matthew. It's not just you.
Well, this actually lets me bring up one more part of the show that I think is worth talking about. And here it's, I think, a really interesting question they raise, but they don't go into it further, which frustrates me. Because I think this, Jessica, gets to what you were saying about that kind of middle ground space. Is at one point they're talking about the code, a couple of the heroes of that older generation, they're talking about the code, and they're talking about it kind of in the terms, Paul, you said, where it's not just we don't kill, but also we don't govern, and like we don't interfere with the governments of the world. And the person who's like is saying to the Utopian, I don't think this code is right, says, you know, remember, we could have stopped World War II. We could have prevented a lot of those killings.
Yeah, I mean, to just add to that, like, they said, I wish we'd done more in World War II, basically.
Yeah.
Like, so they didn't get involved. Not that they would have prevented it, but that they could have kind of headed it off before, be like, oh, Nazi Germany, yeah, let's have that not be a thing. You know, let's stop this Holocaust as soon as we find out about it. But, we can't interfere. Yeah.
And for me, oddly enough, because I was talking to other people recently about robots, what that reminded me of is one of Isaac Asimov's the first law of robotics that he has is one that I kind of feel like these heroes are completely forgetting the second part of. And I'm wondering what you all think of this as a framework in terms of when you can or can't kill. The law is a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm.
Oh, right. Yeah. How does that work out? In that story,
right? Because the question is and this is, you know, essays and essays and essays have been written about. So what happens when the only way to prevent a human being from coming to harm is to harm another human being? But I kind of think that's the question they're asking about World War II is if we draw that line so extremely of we will never kill, does that mean we're basically allowing killings to happen because we're not killing killers?
Well, aren't they killing killers? I mean, yeah, I see your point, but
right.
Yeah, it's a huge question, and it's not just, I mean, I think it's easy to point to World War II and the Holocaust very specifically, because obviously it happened on such a vast scale, but where does the line between, you know, like Paul said earlier, a good framework for a superhero might be we save lives, we keep people from killing other people.
Right.
If you try to do that without breaking the laws, what happens when it's the government killing people, whether it is genocide or even just, you know, again, the death penalty, like,
right.
Yeah, state-sanctioned murder.
Yeah, like the very first appearance of Superman has him breaking a bunch of stuff to stop a man from getting the electric chair because he's not, or a woman, sorry, because she's not guilty of the crime in question. But like, what if they are? Like, what about, you know, cop killings? Like, there's so many, or cops killing people. Like, there's so many iterations of governments killing people directly and indirectly. What about places like Flint where you can't drink the water?
Right.
Yeah, or like governments denying health benefits that would keep someone alive. Like, you can take that to, you know, in so many different directions.
Right. And then if a superhero says, well, I don't interfere with the law, well, again, nothing you're doing is legal. But why is this where you draw that line?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that... Go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to say that the kind of the separation between like kill in battle compared to execute when someone has been subdued and is not presently a threat is, I think, like a really important distinction.
Yeah.
You know? And yeah, that's all I want to say. I mean, we could...
No, but I go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, sorry. Just specifically on that, there's actually a Superman story from the late 80s where Superman executes criminals who are no longer a threat. And this came up when Man of Steel came out, and many, many people were very unhappy that it was a movie that ended with Superman killing somebody. A lot of other people brought up this story, which basically the short version is Superman, this is after Crisis on Infinite Earths, which depowered Superman to a much less godlike level. And he travels to an alternate universe where Kryptonians are still at that godlike level, so much more powerful than him. And General Zod and his cronies show up, and they kill everybody on Earth. They literally just murder every character you've ever thought of. They kill them all. Until at the end of the story, they are depowered by gold kryptonite. So at that point, they're just regular people. And Superman is like, they killed everybody. I can't just walk away from this. So he uses green kryptonite and he kills them. And then he goes back to his universe and he's like, well, that was not a fun field trip. Whereas, and it's not my favorite story. I don't love seeing Superman used that way on a metatextual level. That story it existed to fill in a few continuity gaps that Crisis on Infinite Earths had caused, but I just feel like if you're working really hard to come up with a story where Superman has to make a decision about killing, maybe you should be working on a different superhero. Like, that's not really the point of Superman, but it's just interesting to me. Like, normally I would say I feel much more comfortable with the idea of a superhero killing in the heat of battle to save lives because he doesn't see another way than executing in cold blood. But I can basically vibe with this executing Zod story from 1988 or whatever, and I really cannot vibe with the end of Man of Steel. And I think that has a lot to do with selling the circumstances that the killing, doing a good job of selling the circumstances under which the killing happens. Because, I mean, like you were saying, Paul, about just laser off his arm. Like, just put your hand over Zod's eyes. It's invulnerable, Clark. It's not that hard. Like, there are 10 billion ways to stop him. Like, it's just not a good
take
setup
him up to space. Like,
right? And also, like, if you really care so much about stopping him from killing this family, maybe you should have, moved the fight out of Metropolis before thousands of people were crushed by falling buildings.
Seriously.
I don't know. It's just a thought.
And I think that's also one of the reasons why I was so frustrated by that scene in Jupiter's Legacy, is because I think if you set it up in a way where it is possible that they can defeat this villain without killing him, but Paragon doesn't think so, and so Paragon thinks they have to kill him, now we get a very interesting question.
Yeah.
But in the episode, they make it so overwhelmingly clear that nothing else is working and that everyone's going to die if they don't do this, that frankly, and Paul, I don't know if you, I was kind of amazed, because I thought the whole point was supposed to be that now we had this one situation that is so clear where killing was necessary that the Utopian has to, like, figure out what that means for him.
Right. Yeah, it was such an over-the-top thing. I hated that whole scene. I almost didn't watch the rest of the show. I was like, all right, I'll watch the next episode. And then there were, like, parts I liked. And as it went on, there were actually more parts I liked, but still parts that I really hated. But like, it doesn't even make sense. So it's like, why didn't he just laser off something to begin with? Like, I don't know. Well, I mean, it's very frustrating. It was a very frustrating experience. But yeah, it did seem to me like, if they're about to go nuclear, can't you grab them? Like, wouldn't you want to fly them up out of the atmosphere or something? Like, punch them in the face, or like punch their face literally in, like, about 6 inches. Like, is that's going to stop them from going nuclear? Do you know that? How do you know that? I guess they've done research. They've put this person in jail before. Like, I don't know. It felt like it didn't work, and it did feel like that was such an over-the-top circumstance where they'd already let a bunch of people die, and then maybe a whole bunch more people were going to die, that, yeah, for that to then be compared to, like, someone's literally just, like, plastered against the windshield of a car or something, or against a brick wall, and they're like, oh, we should just kill him now. It's the same thing. It's like, it's not the same thing. It's just not the same thing. You know, but then of course that character, like, did go on to kill someone in a really stupid way also, that, like, just to, like, further be like, oh, but see, like, they were still a threat, and it just, it doesn't feel good, particularly, there was a line at the beginning of the second episode, I think, where a cop, or it was the first or second episode, this cop is like, you know, like, oh, you know, we should just kill them all, right? Like, I think what you did is good. And I was like, oh, no, that sounds definitely worse coming out of a cop's mouth. Like, yeah, and that was that didn't feel good.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I was talking about how this show, I felt like the way that they framed this question, especially bringing in cops and especially having, and I don't want to get too far into the just this show, but just this is the point I was kind of making before about law enforcement. There's that moment. But also there's a moment later where the younger heroes are saying, one of them kind of specifically says, like, and all the rest of them are agreeing, they don't know how dangerous it is out here for us. We're putting our lives on the line to keep people safe, and now they're questioning, like, that we're killing people too much to do that. Right. And I was just like, that sounds like every police union statement I've ever heard after a cop kills someone. Yeah. And my sense is that was written, like, pre, you know, Black Lives, like, I think this was written early in, like, around 2013, 2014, which was, as Jessica, you said, you're right. I mean, cops have been killing people of color, all people, but especially people of color without good cause for centuries. But it's been the last 5 or 6 years that it's been really in the public attention. And I think this was written before that. But even then, if that was the line, that would feel a little weird. But especially to put that line in a TV show today, it just felt so tone deaf and problematic.
Absolutely. That's all I got, absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's possible that the comic was written before Ferguson, but the show wasn't.
Yeah, the comic is 2013, right? Ferguson was 14, I think.
Yeah.
I believe that's correct, yeah.
So it, you know, the comic was written a little before, I guess you'd say, all this rose to broad public consciousness. Right. But then the show wasn't, right? The show, I don't know how long it's been in production, but I imagine the thing had to be out for a while. Like the comic, people had to, 2018, it was announced that they do, you know, this series. And so, you know, having been written in the last few years and produced over that period of time, it feels like you really, you know, like, you should understand when there's going to be certain parallels like that, and you shouldn't make them if that's not what you're deliberately trying to do. And if they are deliberately trying to do that, that's horrible. And if they're not, then they're just tone deaf in a really unfortunate way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, so let me actually pull it back a little bit to the larger question here, and we'll move off the code in a second, but I just want to ask one more question about it. And I think here in this, we're still not okay with the way they frame the code, but I'm wondering if what I'm about to say, it can be a defense of having some kind of a code. And let me start again with that Asimov's law of robotics, that idea that you can't injure a human being, but also you can't not take an action that would stop you. Let me just read it, you know, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. There's a great little short story. I think it was like just a paragraph, but it basically talked about how, like, one interpretation of that could be robots take over the world because robots realize that every single thing a human is doing is causing harm to other humans. And so that the only way to prevent humans from being harmed is to completely take over. And pulling it back to the code thing, I do think that once heroes start thinking, like, I have to not only, like, stop this person who's in the moment holding a gun, but I have to kind of be more proactive to stop the people who will hold a gun tomorrow or who are planning to hold a gun, that can get out of control. And that, Jessica, you brought Kingdom Come earlier. One of the reasons I love that story so much is because I think it is a story about exactly that, of what happens when, because, like, you know, superheroes are getting way out of control, Superman starts to take more and more power, thinking that he has to in order to stop people from hurting others, to the point where he basically just has total control. Is there any argument to be made that a code, maybe a more malleable one, but that having some kind of a code is a bulwark against that kind of a slippery slope of a, you know, that once you start telling yourself that I can fix things, that, you know, now you're a hammer and everything becomes a nail?
I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the point I made before about, like, I don't think that there is any viable code or framework or anything for a superhero or any kind of vigilante, like from, you know, street level on up, but especially somebody with powers like Superman. I don't think there is any viable framework that does not take into account the voices and opinions of the people who are being protected. Which is why, you know, again, like, who watches the Watchmen, to coin a phrase, like, who oversees the Justice League or the Avengers, who says, hey, Superman, that was too far and that wasn't okay. And obviously with some of these characters, either they don't care about the law or they are so powerful that they can't really be affected by it. But I think ethically, like, there is no set of rules you can make on your own individually and say, this is how I'm going to apply my power to the people around me, and they're going to just live with it. You have to have the consent of the people you're protecting.
I only sort of agree. I guess I disagree. I don't know. I think, like, so I think it's always important to listen to people and hear what they have to say and what they want. I think setting constraints for oneself, I think, definitely can be healthy, particularly if you have a lot of power. One of those constraints is maybe, you know, I'm not going to do something people don't want me to do. But, like, that, there's never, like, a consensus, though, is the thing. Like, the idea of being accountable to a community or people at large, like personally, I don't care about the law. Like, I don't see the law as some kind of, like, morality or, like, I don't even really believe in morals or ethics, but, which is funny that I'm on this podcast so much. But, like, I believe in basically deciding what you think you should do, and then you do it. And I think listening to other people, that's actually a theme in Jupiter's Legacy, is that this, you know, the utopian, like, never listens to anybody, basically. And you can't help people if you're not listening to them, if you're not listening to what they want. But if what the people want is the senseless slaughter of the gutter slime that litters this nation for cash and prizes. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a Guar reference. It's a song called Slaughterama. But, like, if what the people want is for you to kill certain people, like, I think it's totally reasonable to not do that. To be like, no, that's not what I'm going to do. If people are like, you know, we don't want you to step in and stop bank robberies or whatever, then I think that's more something that, like, you should listen to people. And personally, like, I could give a fuck about bank robberies. I'm kind of sick of seeing, like, superheroes, like, intervening in bank robberies where it's like, who cares? Like, you know, like, save lives. And, like, if you save lives and then someone's like, I didn't want you to save me. It's like, all right, you can just, you know, take care of that on your own. I won't save you again. Like, but, you know, I think just, like, deciding for oneself, like, you know, I am going to try to reduce the amount of harm that people do to one another, or I am going to try to make people, you know, not kill each other so much. like to stop killings. Like, I don't care if you're like, no, we don't want you to stop, these murders, like, whatever. Like, if I have superpowers and I can go around and stop police from killing people, like, maybe I'll just do that. And like, I don't really care if there's a bunch of people, if like 55% of the people are like, oh no, yeah, we can't interfere with the police, blah, blah, blah. I don't care. I'm gonna do that. And ultimately, I think people are always only ever truly accountable to their own conscience. And people decide, oh, I'm gonna have a code and my conscience is going to tell me, like, I'm going to tell myself ahead of time, this is what I'm going to do. Or, like, I'm going to follow the law because the law is going to tell me ahead of time. Or I'm going to follow, some ethics I got from, religion or my parents or wherever. It's like, ultimately, that's what your conscience told you to do, to follow some particular code if you're following a code. So at the end of the day, everybody's doing the same thing and basically just deciding they're going to do what they think they should do. It's just how much listening to other people and which other people. I mean, I think that's the complicated thing. I think it's a really good point, and the idea of listening to people and wanting to know what they want. But there's so many people to listen to. Ultimately, an individual has to make the call what they're going to do. And then it's up to other people to decide, if they don't like that, what they're going to do about it.
Well, yeah, I don't think we're as far apart as on this necessarily. Like, I'm definitely don't think like, well, I'm thinking about stopping this bank robbery,
right,
but I'm going to check with everyone on the planet first.
I mean, I did lead with, I sort of agree. So I'm sure you're right that we're closer together than...
I think there's obviously expediency is a question in a lot of this. Like, you don't have time to take a poll.
Right. Like, should I stop that comet or not? Hit the heart if you want me to, and the sad face if you don't.
Yeah, and like, I also don't, I agree with you that, like, I'm not necessarily going to say, like, well, check the law. What does the law say? Because there's a lot of bad laws.
Yeah.
But I think that the having engagement with a community and participation in it is part of it. Like, it's not just descending from on high with a rigid preset, okay, if situation A happens,
right,
I will do action B. But having that, like, being part of the world, I guess.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. First of all, I just want to get popcorn as you two are going back and forth on this. Jump in here. To jump in here a bit, I also think that, Paul, I hear where you're coming from, and Jessica, I think you kind of elucidated areas where I would also agree. But the area I would push back on a bit is that I think if there is a very specifically, clearly defined, objective good, that we can just say, okay, if I'm going to just do what I think is the good thing, whether people want me to or not, I could buy that. The problem is that I feel like so much of the harm that's done in this world is the people who think, you know what, I am going to do what's objectively good because it's what these people need, even if they don't think they want it. Because actually, like, maybe it's not the objective good thing. Like, Kingpin is convinced he's doing what is good for the people of New York City. Now, in his case, it's because he's very, like, his own pro-gentrification lens and white supremacy and capitalism and all that is skewing his views. But even putting aside, like, something that obvious, I do feel like, and I think that's, like, Kingdom Come is a great illustration of that, as well as a number of other stories, as well as a number of other instances from our own world, like, people, there just seems like, once you start down that road of, if my conscience tells me this is the right thing to do, and this is the, that this is doing good and I'm going to do it, to me, it just feels, I just don't trust people enough that way. And I know, Paul, this is where you and I always disagree, because you're much more a fan of the individual conscience. I just don't trust individuals that way, because I think that it's just so easy for a person to start seeing their vision of the good being so important that they're doing things that are pretty terrible to people.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that I don't, like, trust other people that much. And, like, but, like, there's only, like, the world is made up of individuals. And, like, I sure as hell don't trust, like, society that more. Like, I mean, just, like, look at the world's history. Look at the world now. Like, I 100% share your concern about, like, what various individuals are going to do following their own conscience. And yes, there is damage caused by people thinking, you know, they're doing the right thing. I think most people think they're doing the right thing. I think the right thing is subjective. It's how do you want the world to be? And how can you act in a manner that will make the world more that way? And not everybody wants the world to be the same way. And ultimately, like, I don't think society has a better answer. I don't think collectively humans do a better job of, like, taking care of one another, really, and not oppressing one another. You know, I mean, oppression is basically all human on human violence. And I think absolutely when you're, you know, you want to engage with the community, if you want to try and make a difference in that community. Whereas, you know, I mean, there's different things, right? There's, like, are you trying to deal with a situation that's, like, an acute thing that's, like, this just happened, I'm going to deal with it right now? Or are you, like, I'm going out on patrol and, you know, I'm going to try and make the world more this way or that way? But, like, where do you get, like, do you try to stop the Holocaust, like in World War II? Like, are you like, oh, well, America doesn't want to get involved yet, so I won't get involved yet. Oh, now America does want to get involved? I'll get involved. Like, that was, like, the German government was doing things. And I honestly, I don't know enough about, you know, the laws of the Third Reich to know whether there was anything that was technically illegal. But, like, my understanding is mostly, like, that was a process of law, which is insane. Yeah. And it's just, it just shows how much, like, which community, you know? It's like there's communities at odds with other communities, and there's people in one community oppressing people in that same community. And so I don't lack concern about individual conscience, but, like, I have a similar, if not larger, concern about what people can do in groups that is also horrible. End rant.
Congratulations, Jessica. You've wandered into an argument that's been going on for 25 years. What are your thoughts?
I have the exact pithy comment that will resolve all of this. No.
Oh, yay!
I've got the answer. No, I don't have the answer.
Oh, I'm so disappointed.
You got me so excited. I stop talking.
If I had the answer, you wouldn't have a podcast anymore.
I think that I don't have the answer either, because I think, Paul, you're right. I mean, all those things are also true. For me, I think, and Jessica, you were saying this, so much of it goes back to, like, it's not society, it's the particular community in which you're acting, you know? Like, for me, you know, to go to the Civil War example, Wanda makes a split-second decision in the moment where she's trying to prevent a huge number of people being killed, and as a result, a smaller number of people are killed. And you can go into all the physics of it, and could she have done something different? Yeah. And, I think probably that's the kind of decision that had to be made. But I also think, like, who was Nigerian or Wakandan who was at the table where those decisions were being talked about, you know, before they went into the capital of Nigeria? And to me, the kind of example, actually, pulling it back to something we all love, that I think of as a great example of what it does mean when a hero is clearly listening to the voices of his community, when a hero is clearly listening to the voices of their community and paying attention, is Daredevil, especially in season 1.
Yeah.
Because so much of what we see is Matt Murdock starts out with his idea of what's necessary to make things better. But then in the course of the show, through his interactions with the different clients they take on from the neighborhood, Mrs. Cardenas being the kind of key example, but a number of others, his idea of what has to be done changes. And he really feels, like, to me, that he feels like a great example of someone who is trying to protect a community, but paying very close attention to what the community is telling him they need.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it also helps that he's protecting, like, 1 square mile.
Right, a neighborhood,
Manhattan.
not like a planet or a country or whatever, for sure.
But it really does simplify the question when he can talk to the people who are being, ousted by Fisk's gentrification, and when he can have these conversations with Claire and Karen and Foggy, who all live there but have different opinions on the best way to handle the situation that they're going through. Like, that's a lot easier than something like the Sokovia Accords.
Right.
But that's sort of the problem with genre that I brought up at the beginning, that what may work as an ethical framework for a story about Daredevil guarding his 10 blocks of Manhattan does not work as a story about Captain America, the shining beacon of humanity, globetrotting,
right,
and throwing his shield at everything he sees.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that both of you made about, Daredevil being a neighborhood hero who actually can interact with the individuals in the area. And, it's not like he's taking a poll or like getting, vote taken and, there's a fair number of people in Hell's Kitchen, having grown up in Hell's Kitchen back when it actually looked like it looked in the Daredevil show. I can speak to that a little bit, but, if the Avengers are going to Lagos, like, who do they talk to? Like, do they talk to the government? Is the government necessarily who they should talk to? Like, should they talk to, are there, I don't know. I think it's definitely more difficult though, right? When they're going to a city in a country that's on a different continent than they are from. It would be nice to have superhero teams that were a little bit more inclusive on a global level, not just in terms of representation of people with different identities in the United States, but like globally. And I don't know, the fact that they're not representing America directly, but like, he's literally Captain America. Is there's a whole another level of potential problems, and what kind of accountability is there? Like, is the accountability from the Nigerian government? Is it from the local government? Like, are they going to have to extradite? It's and it is harder to have, like, when you're dealing with these kind of like potentially global threats. Also, it's like, it's just such a different thing. And that's, to get back to the point that you made that I really loved, not that the other ones, I didn't love them, but but about, like, for a different hero, for a different story, that, the context of the story really does have a big effect on what kinds of stories are going to, what kind of themes you can deal with, and like whether it's the appropriate place for them. And it really does work in a Daredevil series, and it's a little more awkward when you're dealing with more global kinds of stories, I guess.
Yeah, there are also, I think, there are sort of limitations, or maybe that's not the right word, but when it comes to international stories about international politics or other places in the world, but also here in America, there are topics that I don't necessarily want a superhero story about because it feels disrespectful. Or like, I read a couple of stories where superheroes end up in South Africa in the 80s, and I don't want to read anymore.
Right.
Because it feels like not the place for a superhero. And it's also, the reason that, for example, like, Superman did not fight in World War II during World War II because the National Comics was like, oh, well, what are we going to do? Write a comic where he ends the war and then we still have a war?
Right.
So sometimes you do have to sort of elide those very serious real world issues because it's just not appropriate to have. Yeah. It almost feels like making light of it to have a superhero come in and oversimplify it, which is also a problem with, when you've got almost certainly American, almost certainly white writers sending their mostly white American superheroes around the globe and saying, okay, now fix the problems those people have.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's very well put. And we're recording, it'll come out probably next week, but we're recording this just a few days after the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa race riot and massacre of black people and the destruction of Black Wall Street. And it's a very, obviously it's an incredibly important topic for all of us, but especially for people who are fans of kind of genre media that's telling interesting stories. Around that event, there was an awful lot of articles written by great commentators talking about how interesting it was that for a lot of people, they knew about that now because of the TV show The Watchmen. And I was thinking what you were just saying, Jessica, because what a number of those authors were talking about was that when they first realized the show was going to talk about this incredibly important and almost very unknown moment in American history, they got very nervous because they were very worried that they wouldn't do it right. And that, not this is universal, but that, most of the commentators I've seen, especially black commentators, have been very effusive about how well the show addressed that, but also talking about how unique that is. Because that's so often when you try to use a story about superheroes to talk about a very real world situation where very real tragedies happened, it can go incredibly wrong.
Yeah. I think any kind of historical fiction, always there's a level of care that needs to be taken to be like, am I, stepping on the stories of real people here? Am I using some tragedy in a way that is like disrespectful to the real people involved? And then when you add a science fiction layer, when you add superheroes, I think it can get very dicey. And I think the answer is, in terms of like having more global representation in comics, is to have more global representation in comic writers, right? And have more global representation in, screenwriters. And I think we're seeing movement in that direction, right? It's quite a bit late and it's slower than it could be, but I think more of that is going to be better, and you're going to be able to tell a broader range of stories. And I think TV shows often handle things like this better than some other media, I believe, because of the writer's room. Because I think if you get a room full of people who can have different views on something, it's easier to have more representation in a group of 5 people than in one person or 2 people. And so I think often that's a way towards being able to tell a more diverse group of stories. But I do think there's a reason that we have Wakanda and Sokovia and Kasnia in DC, where you're, is there going to be interference in this nation that's not America's politics? Or is there going to be a superhero from there? I think there is a sense of let's make up a place and have it not be a real world place, so we're not commenting on the politics of that actual place. We're going to have it be an African nation somewhere in Africa, or we're going to have it be maybe an Eastern European nation somewhere in, I don't know, where's Sokovia? But I think that makes sense in terms of trying to be careful not to overstep, but at the same time there's so many issues that you kind of hamstring yourself, where you can't deal with certain global issues because you're not willing to write really in a global way, I think.
Right. Yeah, and it certainly seems like a lot of what makes these stories so powerful is that they're metaphors for you can clearly tell what they're metaphors of, right, but that they're metaphors told in this kind of, somewhat fictional world.
Yeah.
So it is not surprising, since of all my guests, you two are the king and queen of tangents, that we have wandered very far from the topic, but are still in a very interesting conversation that's, I think, very tangential and connected to the topic for sure. Jessica, we'd had a whole conversation about Flash comics that we were going to bring into this. I think we've gone long enough and we have some hard outs that we're in jeopardy of passing our time limit that we have to stop.
I see what you did there.
Played.
Exactly. So if you don't mind, I think we're going to hold off on those. But definitely want to bring that back when you and I talk more about comics history coming up. But let me kind of give each of you a chance to kind of have is there one last point or one last question you want to bring up that kind of pulling us back to this idea of when heroes do or don't use lethal force?
I have one more fairly straightforward point. That's, there were a few things I think that we were going to cover and we mostly covered them. But the idea of a person being able to choose to keep their violence non-lethal, and, that obviously plays into real life scenarios, but there's not, in comic books, there's non-lethal violence. And by and large, if somebody kills someone, it's because they decided to kill the person. And I kind of respect that paradigm as its own thing, but I think it's very important to name that is not the real world. There is no non-lethal violence. There is less lethal violence. There are less lethal ways of attempting to apprehend people or to stop violence. But when I was growing up, this kid punched a security guard in the chest and the security guard died. Like, a punch to the chest isn't considered lethal violence in general, right? The intent isn't lethal, but that doesn't mean it can't result in death and thus be lethal. So I do think that there's something problematic in comic book violence that, like, I think we need to be very aware that that's a comic book thing. And unfortunately, I imagine, like, kids growing up watching comic book violence aren't necessarily going to get that sense. And, but to the point that Jessica alluded to earlier, but we didn't cycle back to, the idea that, like, killing and whether you should kill or, like, that you are killing, like, is this somehow more mature kind of content? I don't think it is. I don't know. Jessica, do you want to make that point? Because I feel like you were going to, but you were saving it for later. But, like, I kind of want to, like, pre-cosign.
No, I'll use that as a jumping off point, although I definitely agree with you on that. Like, actually, it turns out that hitting somebody over the head is not just like hitting snooze on your alarm clock. It causes brain damage, and that's why they become unconscious.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, my final point was actually going to be very connected to that, so thank you for the segue. But I think when I have an issue with a superhero story in which a superhero kills, it is either because it's just not considered in any way, shape, or form. It's just thrown out there and it's just done to look cool and nobody cares. I'm looking at you, Arrow. Or because it is contrived in such a way to force the reader or the viewer into going, well, I guess that's how that had to be, which it sounds like that's part of the problem with Jupiter's Legacy. It definitely, for me, it was a huge problem with Man of Steel, as I've implied. But yeah, when the story is more interested in constructing a framework to obsess about killing than talking about preserving and saving lives, that's when I kind of tap out and I'm like, I can't go down this nihilistic road with you. Like, that's where I feel like I'm being pushed into something that's not why I go to superheroes, like not why I'm interested in these stories that are about being more than we are.
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think, when you said that thing about the maturity, that there's a part of me that I wanted to push back a bit. But I think the way you said that actually kind of allows me to better kind of frame where I come from, which is that I feel like, to me, consequences are mature. Like, and so when you are talking about like something that, you know, Captain America throwing his shield willy-nilly, and we never actually deal with the consequences of that, to me that's kind of there's somewhat of a childlike understanding of violence there. And I think there's something mature in being willing to sort of acknowledge the consequences thereof. But you're right that when it just becomes grim dark and, oh, look, our heroes have to kill because we want to show how cool blood spatter looks on their awesome uniforms, you know, that there's nothing mature to me about that. To me, that's just like, ha ha ha, we get to actually kill people. Like, that's kind of like a 13-year-old boy, you know, ideas of it. So in that regard, I think we're very much in agreement.
No, and I think that your way of phrasing it, consequences are mature, is perfect. Like, you bopping the bad guys over the head and they go to sleep and everything's fine is the 6-year-old version of immature, and killing everybody, but you never feel bad about it and you never get in trouble. It just looks really cool is the 13-year-old. Like,
So technically more mature, just going by the math.
It is a bit more mature, but like, I make a lot of jokes about like DC and Marvel have a consultant who's just a 13-year-old boy with an unlimited supply of Mountain Dew who's playing Call of Duty all the time, and they'll be like, hey Timmy, what would be rad? And he's like, he should eviscerate him with his claws. And they're like, great job, Timmy.
Headcanon accepted.
He should strangle him with his own entrails after he eviscerates.
Exactly. See, Timmy loves that, but for me, you know, I just don't like the Timmy consulted stories.
I will say that recently they gave Timmy a lot more power and allowed him to have complete art consultation over a show, and that's where Invincible came from.
Oh, no.
Because I love Invincible on so many levels, but the gore level is just pure 13-year-old boy wish fulfillment. It's so awful. And I just lost 1,000 fans, because most people disagree with me there, but anyway.
Like we have 1,000 fans. No.
There's a lot of people listening to this podcast.
I'd like to have 1,000 fans to lose.
Hey, listen, Jessica, when Paul was giving his big, like, I hate law, I hate banks, I hate government rant, you came very close to getting on a government watch list. So, like, I mean, the NSA definitely listens to this. We've proven that.
And here we are back again with the government watch list jokes.
I did think that when you were talking about Superman killing people, you were going to reference when he killed a certain capitalistic supervillain who became a president.
Yeah, that's what I thought of as soon as you mentioned Superman. I'm like, oh, yeah, Superman, Justice League, the Justice Lords. Like,
oh, right, I forgot about that one.
But, like, why couldn't he laser off his arm? I don't get it. Contrived.
It would cauterize right away. He wouldn't even bleed out.
Right, exactly. Heat vision.
As the person here who was actually missing a limb and was perhaps not quite as sensitive as other amputees would have been to the whole conversation about Bucky having his arm taken off by the Dora Milaje, I should probably speak up about this whole idea of lasering off the arms. But, you know, yeah, I get our point entirely.
I appreciate that.
I'm more mocking myself in that regard, but also thanking the folks who've written in with those kind of comments. I think this is kind of a good place to wrap up, and I just want to leave with one last thing, which is that for me, I am definitely someone who loves grimdark a lot, but I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and Jessica, especially what you're talking about, because I want to give a quick plug for something that I hope we're going to cover soon, because it is so far at the other end of grimdark, even though it is basically a story of, it's more like sci-fi robots, but of like heroes doing amazing things with no killing, no death, no blood, no gore. And that's the Mitchells versus the Machines.
Oh, I gotta check that out.
If you have not seen it, it is I cannot remember being happier at the end of a movie than I was for many years. It is just such a wonderful caption of joy and representation and filmmaking and hilarious social commentary and just a great, great hero movie without grimdark anywhere near it.
I'm writing that down. I'm making a note to myself to watch it as soon as I'm not on a podcast or a Twitch stream or another podcast or watching The Bad Batch should be on another podcast.
Cool. So 2023.
Yes.
All right. Well, as Paul just said, he does a whole bunch of content making under the name Zed Madman. He's doing poker streams a lot these days. Some of them on his Twitch stream under Zed Madman. I'm also doing Twitch streams under The Ethical Panda, and Paul's basically being my mentor, teaching me poker, or teaching me to get better at a particular kind of poker game. Definitely check out both of our Twitch streams and check out all the stuff Paul does under Zen Madman. Jessica, for those who want to find out you, I know you're doing a lot of writing and other kind of content creation. Where can folks find your stuff?
Not on Twitch. I don't know how it works. But I'd be great to play poker against because I don't know how to play and you'd win.
Ethics, yeah, okay, sure.
I do a lot of writing about comics at bookriot.com. And I also have a short story coming out in an anthology on July 13th. It's
awesome.
Called Sword Stone Table. It's coming out from Vintage, and it is all retellings of Arthurian legends from a whole array of amazing, diverse contributors. It's an amazing collection, if I do say so myself, and highly recommend everybody's stories, and maybe give mine a read too. Why not?
Sure.
And I'm on Twitter at @JustPlummer.
Can we pre-order that book?
You can pre-order that book. It is available for pre-order at all your major retailers.
Awesome. We will include a link to that in the show notes. So, Jessica, Paul, thank you guys so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I definitely want to get both of you on together because I think there's a great dynamic here, and I'm really excited to go deeper with that in other conversations. And to all our listeners, as I said, what'd you think about this episode? If you have thoughts on this one, on other episodes, let us know. You can give us all our feedback at theethicalpanda@gmail.com or going to theethicalpanda.com or finding us on Twitter or Facebook. And of course, remember that this podcast is a proud member of the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. There you'll find great podcasts about Marvel, Star Wars, which I run, Star Trek, stuff under Bingers Assemble. We're doing all sorts of, anytime a third or fourth or ninth movie is coming out in a series, we're often going to do go over all the back ones. We're going to do Fast and Furious. They just did a couple on the Conjuring. Recently we did ones on the Godzilla vs. Kong movies. Lots of great stuff at the Stranded Panda Podcast Network. So please check that out. Please check out my other podcasts and everything else that Paul and Jessica are doing. And most importantly, have a great day.